Documentation in human services. Clients seek the services of mental health practitioners for a variety of mental health issues. Case documentation in mental health is the mechanism that is utilized by clinicians to track the progress or decline of client functioning and to assess how close the client is to achieving treatment goals. Without documentation regarding the issues addressed during therapeutic sessions, utilized intervention methods, and the client's response to the intervention, the clinician would find it difficult to determine if the intervention was effective or whether the most pressing issues presented by the client were being addressed. Good case documentation demonstrates practitioner competency, allows readers of the information to understand how client needs have been addressed, and protects the clinician from legal liability. The content of case records can have a powerful and profound effect on the lives of clients and their families. For example, the professional opinion that is expressed in a case record can deny benefits to a client, determine whether a child is removed from the home, or support whether a parolee is released from prison. Long after professionals leave their employment, what has been written about the client will endure for others to read, interpret, implement, speculate about its meaning, or evaluate. To help maintain focus, clinicians should keep in mind the importance of what they write, for whom, and for what purpose. For example, a psychological evaluation may be utilized to determine which parent should gain custody of his or her child, or whether an individual is a safety risk to society and should be sent to prison. In either scenario, a clinician's recommendations will have an impact on the client and those who are touched by the client's life. In the helping professions, a key phrase that is always used is, if it's not documented, it never happened. And so documentation is the key to outlining a client's treatment, their progress, the interventions that were used, outcomes, and areas for concern. Documentation is significant in the organization of care, within the organization, and outside of the organization. Continuity of care across those providing service to the client. So that could mean a transition in case managers, or a case manager interacting with a case manager from a different organization to collaborate and provide services. For risk management, ethical and legal guidelines that require us to provide significant documentation on the client and the treatment. Compliance with agency and state regulations, as well as compliance with insurance companies. Quality assurance to make sure that individuals are following best practice, and coordination of services to make sure that there is no duplication in services, or that people are trying different interventions and not communicating with one another. It is important that all documentation follows some general guidelines. Consider all case management records to be legal documents. Remember that records may be viewed by judges, attorneys, and even clients have the right to access their file. Documentation should always follow the agency, organization, state, and/or other governing bodies' protocols. Documentation should reflect any significant client, family, or secondary service provider contact. There's a form that most agencies use that is called a client contact sheet, which just lists the date and time, the type of contact, who was the professional that made the contact, and a brief note of what it was regarding. For example, if a client misses an appointment and you call and leave a message on the voicemail for the client, if you were given permission to leave a voicemail on the client's phone, then you would record that as a contact made on this specific date and time. It was a phone call, so it wasn't a face-to-face meeting or other type of contact, but specifically a phone call and made by you and whatever your title is, followed by the note that a voicemail was left and that client gave permission and informed consent to leave voicemails on that client's phone. Don't leave any blanks in documentation. It's important to write something, even if it's of nothing really to note. NA is better than leaving something blank, which is an indication that you may have overlooked it. Mark any error with a single line and your initials. Never use a correction fluid or tape such as whiteout to correct an error. At the bottom of the page is an example of a correction that you may make in your notes. The first sentence is the originally recorded statement. The client reported that she left the baby outside the home while she engaged in an argument with her boyfriend. I noted that there was an error in this sentence, the way it was recorded and the way that that can be perceived, and the client specified that she left the baby inside the living room while she engaged in an argument with her boyfriend. In this specific example, you would put one single line through left the baby outside the home and replace it with left the baby inside the living room. One single line through the words that are incorrect, and then initial that you were the one that completed the correction. There are multiple areas that require documentation in counseling and human services. Everything from the intake to the exit interview should be recorded and documented in an appropriate way. Documents that are pretty consistent throughout include intake paperwork, a treatment plan or service plan, any type of assessments that the client takes, clinical assessment tools or otherwise, diagnostic tools. The results from that would also be documented in case notes. And typically there's some type of exit or discharge paperwork that is done upon termination. Supporting documents include the informed consent, referral paperwork, and any release of information that the client signs. Case notes, or progress notes, are brief written notes in a client's treatment record, which are produced by a therapist as a means of documenting aspects of his or her treatment. Case notes may also be used to document important issues or concerns related to the client's treatment. Legal and ethical standards in all of the helping professions clearly state that the therapist must maintain some kind of record of the treatment that they provide. Case notes must prove delivery of service with accurate, timely, objective, specific, concise, descriptive, consistent, and pertinent information. They must outline the reason for contact, such as client called requesting XYZ. Case manager conducted scheduled home visit. Write in the third person and refer to all individuals by title. Client, case manager. Write in the present tense and identify the source for material that is controversial or potentially involves some of the client's perception. For example, the client describes her parents as severe alcoholics, rather than the client's parents were alcoholics. The client specifically describing their parents as severe alcoholics includes the client's perception of the parents. So it's important to allow the client to take ownership of that statement because we don't know whether that is necessarily true or to what degree that is true. Describe client mood, affect, and symptoms using client's words first and then your professional impression. Always end notes with a plan. For example, case manager will send referral for housing. The first function of a case note or progress note is to record services provided. The second function of a progress note is to document the course of treatment. Both functions of the notes are essential elements of evidence-based practice. What should you include in a case note? We went over some of the general guidelines. Next, you want to include who, the name, qualifications, and/or title of the qualified staff providing the service or intervention, what was done, the specific interventions or skills used, where is the physical site where the services were provided, the office, the client's home, etc. When, the date, the length of service, and time of day. Why were the services done? The intended goal, objective, and outcome related to the interventions and skills of the services. how it was conducted, using concrete, measurable, and specific descriptions, along with the client's response and progress. There are different formatting styles of case notes, and it will depend on your agency or your particular preference. One common note is a SOAP note, and that's the one that we're going to focus on. S stands for subjective. The subjective information pertains to what the client reveals during the session. Subjective information may include a client's chief complaint or history of presenting illness. A clinician would also document client and family reports of relevant information. Direct quotes from the client should be put in quotation marks. Only exact words from the client should be in quotes. Things discussed during the session are actually paraphrased statements from the client. What the therapist said to the client may include sentences starting with the words discussed, talked about, and stated. The clinician should use few quotes to avoid the possibility of misquoting. The O stands for objective. The objective information deals with facts of the matter such as baseline data, physical exam, or diagnosis. This also includes information provided by the mental status exam, including what the client looked like if different from usual, or if it's related to the treatment objective. Orientation, is the client aware of person, place, and time? Behaviors, actions, mood, or affect. In describing mood, you should always use the word appeared prior to the word that you're using to describe the mood. Appeared neutral. Appeared elevated. Affect describes the physical or behavioral indicators of mood, such as smiling, frowning, tearful, fidgeting. Do not use words such as happy, sad, scared, or mad without qualifying how the clinician arrived at this determination. The A stands for assessment. The assessment section is where the clinician interprets the objective information as well as the subjective data. The clinician will relay the client's mood and affect, how the client is oriented, if an individual is suicidal or homicidal, and if so, what intervention did the clinician use? In this section, the clinician should use sentences starting with the words appears or seems. This is a clinical impression of the client's progress towards their goals and objectives. Does the client seem to understand the goals and the situation? Do they appear to be making progress in this area? If the client needs to address a new treatment goal, it would be stated in this section. And finally, P stands for plan. The plan indicates what the clinician plans to do next with this client. This may be what the clinician plans to do during the next session, or the clinician may continue to follow up from the previous session. The clinician may indicate that he or she intends to continue the assessment if it has not been completed, or can outline the intervention plan. Frequency and duration of therapy should be documented in this section. Long-term goals and at least one short-term objective should be noted as part of the plan. Any new goals should also be stated in this section. Things to avoid in case notes. Never use casual abbreviations or slang or acronyms that individuals who are reading it may not know. Do not take shortcuts at the cost of clarity. Reread your notes prior to making them official. Do not use generalizations or overinterpretations. Avoid grammatical errors. Avoid negative, biased, and prejudicial language. Write in a style that is factual, objective, specific, and to the point while avoiding jargon. Omit details of the client's intimate life unless it's relevant to the plan. Avoid using medical diagnoses that have not been verified by a medical professional. For example, instead of saying that the client is depressed, say, the client states that he is having feelings of sadness or is experiencing a depressed mood. Or describe the symptoms that the client is describing. The client describes seeing hallucinations or is feeling sad on a daily basis. Some things to include are highlighting the client's strengths, their support system, and their coping mechanisms. Don't just report facts as you have been told, but specify where the information came from. Client reports or client states. Remember to report negative as well as positive observations, information, and findings. Each page should have the client's name or identification code so that if your documentation gets separated, you will know which chart it belongs in. The writing of case notes and other documentation is very important. We have to use appropriate detail without providing too much. It has to be organized and have appropriate headings and a logical progression so that it makes sense to someone who wouldn't be involved in the individual's case directly when it was written. The writing should be thoughtful and reflect the application of professional knowledge, skills, and judgment. They need to be concise and serve the purpose of clinical documentation. Use only relevant direct quotes. Distinguish clearly between facts, observations, hard data, and opinions. Be sure to state the source and make sure that you're consistent throughout all of your documentation. Good case documentation should tell the story of why a client was referred for services, the nature of services that were delivered, by whom services were delivered, the outcome of each intervention, and the client's response to strategies that were administered. Progress notes or case notes do not replace other types of documentation, such as assessments, treatment plans, or incident reporting. However, case notes act as a unifying framework to objectively document client mental health or behavioral concerns that may be identified in any of these other types of documents. The narrative should contain only the most relevant information related to services being rendered. If the following statement, clinician played checkers with client, period, staff 1, period, appeared in a client chart, consider the relevance of this standalone statement. But what if the service being provided was anger management therapy? The statement is more meaningful when it goes on further to describe how the client handled loss. The following additional information, quote, client became red in the face, hands were shaking, and threw the checkerboard across the room, end quote, would make the previous statement relevant enough to be included in the case record. Without the additional information, the original statement gives no insight to client functioning or service provision and would be better if omitted from the documentation. Some tips and suggestions for moving forward so that you don't get overwhelmed with documentation in the field. Stay organized. Carry a notepad at all times, but be sure, if this contains identifying client information, that it is secured appropriately. Maintain an encounter log so that you know that you have to go back and make a progress note or a case note. Secure enough time to document. And use the resources that you have, fellow coworkers, supervisors, etc., to improve your documentation skills.